We think we understand winter. We feel a chill in the air. We see the days grow shorter, and we retreat into our well-lit homes, insulated from the worst of the cold. But this is a modern comfort. To truly understand winter, we must travel back in time, to the fjords and valleys of Scandinavia 1,000 years ago, to a world lit only by fire and stars. We must try to imagine the coming of the long night. It was not just the cold, a force so profound it could freeze the very earth solid. It was the darkness, a deep, psychological, and seemingly unending darkness that would swallow the world for months on end. In the northernmost settlements, the sun would vanish from the sky entirely, leaving the landscape locked in a perpetual twilight. How did the Norse people, the Vikings, survive this? How did they endure not just the physical hardship, but the immense mental and spiritual weight of a world without light? In this story, we are going to explore the remarkable system of survival that allowed the Vikings to master the winter. We will step inside their smoky longhouses, examine the larder that held a year's worth of foresight, and listen to the stories told around a central fire. This is not a tale of axes and dragon ships, but a quieter, more profound story of resilience, community, and the remarkable art of enduring the dark. Number 1. The Longhouse, a vessel against the dark. The first key to understanding Viking winter survival was the vessel they built to contain it, the Longhouse. From the outside, in the depths of winter, it would have looked like little more than a feature of the landscape itself. A long, low, gently curved mound, like the overturned hull of a great ship, half buried in the earth, its turf-covered roof heavy with a thick blanket of snow. There were no large windows, only a few small openings, and a single heavy wooden door designed to keep the precious heat from escaping. It was a fortress built not against armies, but against the cold itself. To step inside was to enter another world. The air would be thick with the smells of wood smoke, of drying herbs, of damp wool, and of life itself, both human and animal. The interior was a vast, single room, its space defined by 2 rows of timber posts that supported the heavy roof. The heart of this world was the langeld, the long fire, a stone-lined fire pit that ran down the center of the hall. This was the only source of light and the only source of heat. There was no chimney. The smoke would drift upwards, staining the rafters a deep, resinous black, before finding its way out through a small, shuttered hole in the roof. This ever-present smoke would have stung the eyes, but it also cured the meats hanging from the rafters and helped to preserve the timbers of the house itself. Along the sides of the hall were raised wooden platforms, covered in furs and woven blankets. These were the spaces for living where people would sit, work, and sleep. The earth floor was hard-packed and covered in straw for insulation. But the Vikings were not alone in this space. During the harshest months, they would bring their most valuable livestock, a prized cow, a few sheep or goats inside, into stalls at one end of the longhouse. This was a crucial act of synergy. The animals were protected from the brutal cold, and their body heat contributed to the warmth of the hall, a living furnace helping to keep the human inhabitants alive. The longhouse was not just a building, it was a self-contained ecosystem, a masterpiece of insulation and shared warmth, a smoky, fire-lit vessel designed to carry the entire household through the long, dark voyage of winter. Number 2. The larder feasting on foresight. Winter survival for the Vikings did not begin with the first snowfall. It began in the bright, long days of summer. Every member of the household was part of a year-long, constant effort of gathering and preservation, a race against time to fill the larder before the darkness returned. Their success in winter was a direct result of their diligence in summer. To fail in this task was to condemn one's family to starvation. Their methods were ingenious, born of necessity. The seas and rivers provided a bounty of fish, particularly cod and herring. Great quantities would be caught and preserved. Cod would be hung on massive wooden racks, exposed to the cold, dry air, until it became desiccated and hard as a piece of wood. This was turfisk, or stockfish, a protein-rich food that could last for years. Herring would be heavily salted or smoked, their oils preserving them through the winter months. Livestock that could not be supported through the winter was slaughtered in the autumn. The meat was salted, dried, or smoked, ensuring nothing went to waste. Dairy was also crucial. Milk from cows and goats was transformed into foods that would last. It was churned into butter or made into cheese. Most importantly, it was fermented into a thick, sour, yogurt-like substance known as skyr, a food packed with protein that would keep for months in cool storage pits dug into the earth. Wild berries like lingonberries were gathered and preserved in barrels of water or honey. Grains like barley and rye were carefully harvested and stored, ready to be ground into flour for flatbreads or brewed into the thick, nutritious ale that was a staple of the Viking diet. The winter meal, therefore, was not a meager affair, but it was a meal of limited variety. It was a feast of preserved taste, the intense saltiness of cured meat, the smoky tang of fish, the sourness of fermented milk and cabbage. It was a testament not to what could be gathered in the moment, but to the hard work and foresight of the seasons that had passed. To survive the winter was to literally eat the memory of summer. Number 3. The fire lit, hours weaving the social fabric. With the land frozen and the seas too treacherous for travel, the great physical work of farming and raiding came to a halt. But this did not mean life stopped. The winter was a long, enforced period of domestic industry, a time for the quiet, essential tasks that held their world together. The long, dark hours by the central fire were not empty. They were filled with the sounds of making and mending. The men would take out their tools, repairing the iron fittings of a plough, sharpening an axe, or carving intricate designs into a wooden spoon or a new chest. The great sails of the longships, made of heavy, oiled wool known as vadmau, would be brought into the Longhouse to be painstakingly mended. Each tear a memory of a previous voyage, each stitch a preparation for the next. Fishing nets would be repaired, their knots checked and tightened. For the women, the loom was central. They would spend endless hours spinning raw wool into thread and weaving it into the sturdy cloth needed for clothing, blankets, and sails. They would mend worn garments, patch holes, and prepare the household's clothing for the year ahead. The rhythmic clacking of the loom and the soft whirring of the spindle were the heartbeat of the winter longhouse. But perhaps the most important work of all was the work of the mind and the community. Winter was the season for stories. The family would gather around the fire, and a skald, a trained poet and storyteller, or simply the head of the household, would recite the great epic poems. They would tell of the creation of the world, of Odin's quest for wisdom, of Thor's battles with giants, and of the heroic deeds of legendary kings and ancestors. These stories were not just entertainment, they were history, religion, and lore, all woven into one. They reinforced the cultural values of courage, honor, and resilience. The children would learn their place in the cosmos by hearing these tales. They also played games, most famously a strategic board game known as Hnefatafel, or King's Table, a game of strategy and tactics that kept their minds sharp. These firelit hours of craft and storytelling were the essential social glue that bound the community together, reaffirming their shared identity and building the collective strength needed to face the darkness. Number 4. Yule, the Festival of Light. In the very heart of the deepest darkness came the most important festival of the year. Around the time of the winter solstice, the shortest day and the longest night, the Vikings celebrated Yule, or Yule. This was not a quiet, somber occasion. It was a loud, defiant, and joyful festival, a ritualistic battle against the encroaching dark. It was a community-wide declaration that they would not be conquered by winter. The festival would last for several days. A great Yule log would be brought into the Longhouse and set alight in the central hearth, a massive piece of wood chosen to burn for the duration of the festivities, symbolizing the endurance of heat and light in the face of the cold. The larder was thrown open, Great feasts were held, with the best of the preserved meats being brought out. Enormous quantities of strong ale, brewed specifically for the occasion, were consumed. It was a time of generosity and community, reaffirming bonds between families and chieftains. But it was also a time of deep spiritual significance. Oaths were sworn on a sacred boar, a sonar gultra, with men making great boasts about the deeds they would accomplish in the coming year. Sacrifices and offerings were made to the gods. They would honor Odin, the Allfather, often associated with the dead and the wild hunt that was thought to rage across the winter sky. They would honor Thor for his strength, and perhaps most importantly, they would honor Freyr, the god of fertility and prosperity, encouraging him to return life and warmth to the fields. Underpinning all of this was a deep cosmological fear. The Norse believed in the prophecy of Ragnarok, the end of the world, which would be preceded by the Fimbulvetur, or Great Winter, 3 successive years of darkness and cold that would wipe out all life. Every long winter held the terrifying echo of this potential doom. Yule was therefore a critical psychological turning point. It was a conscious effort by the entire community to take agency, to fight back against the darkness with fire, food, and fellowship, and to ensure that the sun would be reborn and the great cycle of the seasons would continue. It was a festival of hope, lit by a roaring fire in the heart of the long night. Conclusion: the art of endurance. And so, we see that Viking survival in the winter was not a single skill, but a complete and sophisticated system. It was a masterpiece of resilience, woven from many threads. The ingenious architecture of the Longhouse, a vessel that held both people and the means of their survival. The meticulous foresight of a food preservation strategy that began in the summer sun. The quiet industry and storytelling that strengthened social bonds in the fire-lit darkness, and the defiant, hopeful rituals that pushed back against the psychological weight of a world without light. The Vikings did not simply endure the winter. They mastered it. They understood that to survive the cold, you needed more than just a warm fire. You needed a full larder, a strong community, a rich culture, and an unshakable belief that even after the longest, darkest night, the sun would always, eventually, return. Their story is a powerful testament to the art of endurance, a lesson written not in stone, but in the smoke, songs, and firelight of the Longhouse. But survival was not lived entirely within the communal warmth of the Longhouse. Life demanded that they step out into the frozen world, whether to gather firewood, tend to the animals in their byres, or simply to move between farmsteads. To do so required a different kind of shelter, a personal and wearable fortress against the cold. This was a technology developed over centuries, a sophisticated system of layers, where each garment played a crucial role. Let us look, then, at the 6 key items of clothing and personal gear that made life and survival possible in the harshest of winters. Number 1. The woolen tunic, kyrtil. The foundation of all Viking clothing, for both men and women, was the tunic, or kyrtil. This was the garment worn against the skin, or over a simple linen undershirt. In winter, these were almost always made of wool, the miracle fiber of the north. The sheep the Vikings raised were hardy, long-fleeced animals whose wool was rich in lanolin, a natural grease that made the fabric remarkably water-resistant and able to insulate even when damp. The tunic was a simple but effective design, typically T-shaped, often constructed with triangular inserts called gussets, under the arms and at the sides, to allow for freedom of movement without wasting precious cloth. A winter tunic would be woven from thicker, heavier yarn, its dense weave creating a powerful barrier against the cold. It was a profoundly personal item, spun and woven by the women of the household, imbued with the labor of the family. To put on a woolen tunic was to wrap oneself in the first layer of a carefully constructed defense system, a soft, breathable barrier that held the body's precious heat close. Number 2. The trousers, brakkur. For the men, The next essential item was a pair of trousers, or bracker. These were not the loose, flowing garments of warmer climates, but were practical, relatively close-fitting trousers designed for warmth and mobility. Like the tunic, they were typically made of wool, often in a sturdy twill weave that could withstand the rigors of daily work. Some were simple, plain designs, while others, belonging to wealthier individuals, might be dyed with patterns or woven in a distinctive herringbone style. Their design was crucial for surviving the cold. They allowed for layers to be worn underneath, such as linen wrappings around the lower legs for extra insulation, and their tailored fit meant they did not snag or catch when moving through deep snow or dense undergrowth. They were a garment of pure utility, a testament to the practical, no-nonsense approach the Vikings had to their environment. They were the essential connection between the warmth of the upper body and the protection of the feet, a key component in sealing the body from the cold. Number 3. The cloak, skikja. The final, and perhaps most vital, layer worn outdoors was the great cloak, known as a skikja, or, if lined with fur, a felder. This was a large, rectangular, or semicircular piece of heavy, dense wool. It was not a tailored coat, but a versatile wrap that was draped across the shoulders and fastened on one side, usually the sword arm side for men, with a single, strong pin or brooch. This single fastening point left the arms free for work while keeping the body enveloped in warmth. The cloak was a multi-tool, essential for survival. In a sudden snowstorm, it could be pulled over the head to act as a hood. On a long journey, it served as a thick, warm blanket at night. Its sheer weight and density made it an almost impenetrable barrier to the wind. The quality of a cloak, fineness of its weave, the richness of its dye, the material of its clasp was also one of the most visible indicators of a person's wealth and status. To own a heavy, well-made cloak was to own a personal, portable shelter, a final shield against the worst the winter could offer. Number 4. Leather shoes. Score. Protecting the feet from the biting cold and dampness of the snow was a matter of life and death. The Vikings crafted simple but effective shoes, or score, from leather. These were typically low-cut, ankle-high shoes made from a single piece of hide, often cow or goat, that was folded around the foot and stitched together at the heel and toe. This turn shoe construction meant the stitching was on the inside, protecting the thread from wear and tear. The key to their effectiveness in winter lay in insulation. The leather itself was often treated with oils and waxes to make it more water-resistant, but the real warmth came from what was worn inside. The shoes would be stuffed with insulating materials like dried grass, moss, or, for those who could afford it, scraps of felted wool. Thick, woolen socks, made using a technique called knoll binding, or needle binding, created a dense and incredibly warm fabric. A Viking moving through the snow was walking on a cushion of insulation, their feet protected from the frozen ground by layers of wool, grass, and treated leather. Number 5. The hat and mittens. While the body was protected by layers, the extremities, the head, and hands were the most vulnerable to the rapid loss of heat. Simple, practical headwear was essential. Most common were small, close-fitting caps made from wool or felt, and sometimes from leather or fur. These caps, often conical or rounded in shape, served the simple but vital purpose of preventing heat from escaping through the scalp. Equally important were mittens. Unlike gloves with individual fingers, mittens keep the fingers together, sharing their warmth. Viking mittens were typically made from wool using the same knoll binding technique as socks, which created a thick and durable fabric without seams that could let in the cold. For tasks requiring more dexterity, simple fingerless gloves might be used, but for long periods outdoors, the mitten was the superior technology for preserving the feeling and function of the hands. These were not items of high fashion, but of fundamental, practical necessity. Number 6. The brooch, fibula. The final item was not a piece of clothing in itself, but the crucial piece of technology that held the entire system together, the brooch. Known to archaeologists by its Latin name, fibula, this was the essential fastener of the Viking Age. It was used by both men and women to secure the all-important cloak at the shoulder. Without it, the cloak would be an unwieldy and impractical blanket. With it, it became a functional garment. These brooches came in many shapes and sizes. The most common was the penannular, or ring-shaped brooch, a simple circle of iron or bronze with a long, sharp pin, but they could also be incredibly ornate, status-defining works of art. Wealthy Vikings would possess massive brooches made of silver or gold, intricately decorated with detailed carvings of twisting animals and mythological scenes. These were not just fasteners, they were expressions of identity, wealth, and social standing. Yet, at their core, they had a simple, vital function: to pin the outer layer of protection in place, sealing the wearer within their own personal fortress of warmth. It was the small, strong point upon which the entire winter wardrobe depended. But survival was not merely a matter of rough, practical endurance. To be clothed against the elements was only half the battle. To live for months on end in the close, smoky, and crowded confines of the Longhouse, sharing the air with family, retainers, and livestock, required another kind of order, another layer of deliberate care. This was a discipline directed not at one's clothing, but at one's own body. The modern image of the unkempt, wild-haired barbarian is a fiction, a caricature created by their enemies. The sagas, the accounts of foreign travelers, and the archaeological record all paint a very different picture. One of a people who were fastidiously, almost ritually, concerned with their personal appearance. This was a practice that even their rivals noted with a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. The 13th century English chronicler, John of Wallingford, complained that the Viking men who had settled in England were far too popular with local noblewomen because they combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and changed their garments often. To the English, this level of grooming seemed vain and effeminate. To the Vikings, it was simply a mark of civilization. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Vikings on the Volga River, described them as physically imposing, but also noted their habit of washing their face and head each morning in a shared basin of water, a ritual he found both communal and strangely unhygienic, yet a ritual nonetheless. The most essential tool for maintaining this order, an item so important that it was carried by nearly every man and woman, was the comb. Viking combs, carved from the bone and antler of deer, were not simple afterthoughts. They were prized personal possessions, and some of the most common grave goods found by archaeologists. Often kept in their own protective cases, these combs were frequently double-sided, with coarse teeth for detangling long hair and thick beards, and fine teeth for removing dirt, debris, and lice, a constant threat in the communal living space. They were objects of art as well as utility, their handles intricately carved with geometric patterns, knotwork, or the heads of dragons and other beasts. To possess and use a comb was a fundamental part of Viking identity. It was a daily act of imposing a human pattern onto the wildness of nature, a small but significant ritual that separated the Norse person from the unkempt other, a declaration of order in a world of chaos. Washing in the deep of winter was a challenge, but one they met with ingenuity and ritual. The very name for Saturday in Old Norse, and in modern Scandinavian languages, is logadagur, literally, washing day. This was the day set aside for personal hygiene. While a full bath in a frozen river was out of the question, they would use large wooden tubs inside the Longhouse, filling them with water laboriously hauled from a well and heated with stones pulled glowing from the long fire. They used a harsh, lye-based soap made from animal fat and wood ash, effective at cutting through the grime of the week. Even more significant was the use of small, separate structures akin to a sauna or sweat lodge, known as a bath stoffer. Here, a fire would heat a large pile of stones, and water would be thrown onto them to create a thick, cleansing steam. This was a place to escape the damp chill of winter, to sweat out the impurities of the body, and to socialize. It was both a hygienic practice and a deeply therapeutic one. A welcome, humid heat in a world of biting, dry cold. The grooming kit found in archaeological digs reveals an even more intimate level of care. Small bronze or silver tweezers were common, used for plucking stray hairs. Delicate ear spoons, often hung on a ring with a comb and other personal items, were used for cleaning the ears. And razors have been found, suggesting that while beards were a powerful symbol of masculinity, they were also shaped, trimmed, and managed. To be a Viking was not to be wild, but to be tamed, shaped, and presented with conscious care. These small rituals of grooming were a daily act of defiance against the grime and entropy of the world, a way of maintaining health, self-respect, and a distinct social identity in the heart of the long, dark winter, the art of healing tending the body's fire. To live through a Viking winter was to be intimately aware of the fragility of the human body. In the crowded, smoky confines of the Longhouse, coughs and fevers could spread with alarming speed. The long months of limited diet could weaken the immune system. The daily work of chopping wood or tending to animals in icy conditions brought the constant risk of injury, from a deep cut to a broken bone. With no concept of germ theory or modern medicine, how did the Vikings tend to the sick and injured? How did they nurse the body's inner fire when it threatened to flicker and die? Their approach to medicine was a pragmatic and complex blend of practical herbalism, folk wisdom, and magical ritual. The Viking understanding of health did not separate the physical from the spiritual. An illness could be caused by a chill or a bad piece of food, but it could just as easily be the result of a curse from an enemy, or the malevolent influence of unseen beings, dwarves, elves, or spirits known as landvatir. Therefore, healing required treating both the visible symptoms and the invisible cause. The primary healer in most households was the matriarch, the woman of the Longhouse, whose knowledge of herbal remedies was passed down through generations. For more serious ailments, one might consult a specialist, a professional healer known as a lacnir, or, for ailments believed to have a supernatural cause, a wise woman, or seeress, known as a velva. The Viking apothecary was the natural world around them, and their knowledge was extensive. They understood the power of plants that could be gathered in summer and preserved for the winter. Yarrow, a common wildflower, was known as woundwort for its ability to staunch bleeding and prevent infection when applied as a poultice. The bark of the willow tree, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, was chewed or brewed into a tea to combat fevers and relieve pain. Angelica, a tall aromatic plant, was prized for treating coughs and respiratory ailments, and the spongy sphagnum moss, gathered from bogs, was used as a highly effective and sterile wound dressing, valued for its incredible absorbency and natural antiseptic properties. Their practical skills could be surprisingly advanced. Skeletons found in Viking graves show evidence of remarkable medical care. Archaeologists have found bones that were broken and then carefully set, healing so cleanly that the person would have regained full use of the limb. There is even evidence of sophisticated dental work, including filed teeth and attempts to treat infections. The sagas, while literary, are filled with accounts of treating grievous battlefield wounds, of stitching cuts, and assessing the severity of internal injuries. But this practical knowledge was always intertwined with the magical. A healer would not just apply a poultice of yarrow, they would also chant a healing verse, a magical incantation known as a galder, over the wound to drive out the sickness and knit the flesh back together. Viking medicine was a holistic system. It was about tending to the body's fire with every tool they possessed, both physical and spiritual, to ensure that the microcosm of the individual survived just as the macrocosm of the household did. But tending to the body's fire with herbs and healing hands was only part of the great battle against the winter. Perhaps the greatest challenge of the long night was not to the flesh, but to the spirit. For months on end, in the deep, oppressive dark, with the world outside reduced to a frozen, silent wasteland, the true enemy was despair. It was the slow, creeping dread that the sun might not return, the psychological weight of isolation, and the friction of communal living in close quarters. So how did the Vikings fortify the mind? What was the inner fortress they built to withstand the psychological siege of winter? Their resilience was not an accident. It was a product of their entire worldview, a mental toolkit forged in the harsh realities of their environment. Let us explore the key beliefs that gave them this incredible fortitude. The acceptance of fate. Word. The modern mind often thinks of freedom as the ability to choose any path. The Viking mind, however, was anchored by a profoundly different and powerful concept. Word or fate. They did not believe in a universe of endless possibilities, but rather that the broad strokes of a person's life, and particularly the moment of their death, were preordained, spun into a great cosmic tapestry by the three mysterious figures known as the Norns, who dwelt at the foot of the world tree, Yggdrasil. To us, this might seem paralyzing, a fatalistic belief that would encourage inaction. But for the Vikings, it was the opposite. It was liberating. If the ultimate outcome was already decided, there was no point in cowering in fear or wasting energy on anxieties about what might happen. The only thing a person truly had control over was how they met their fate. The choice was not if you would face hardship, but whether you would face it with courage and dignity. This mindset was a powerful antidote to despair. Enduring the winter without complaint, doing your part for the household, and facing the darkness with a steady heart were not just practical necessities. They were acts that affirmed your character and allowed you to live up to your destiny, no matter how harsh it might be. The pursuit of reputation. Doma. In a world where the concept of a blissful, heavenly afterlife was vague at best, what was the ultimate goal? For the Vikings, the closest thing to immortality was one's reputation, or doma. It was the judgment of your deeds, the story that would be told about you around the long fires after you were gone. As the Old Norse poem, the Havamal, puts it, cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will also die, but the word fame of a dead man never dies. This pursuit of a good name was the central social and ethical driver of their society. A person was judged by their actions. Generosity, loyalty, courage, and reliability were the pillars of a strong reputation. In the intense, closed environment of the winter Longhouse, this was more important than ever. To be seen as lazy, to complain about the cold or the meager food, or to fail to contribute to the household's tasks, would directly damage your doma. The powerful social pressure to be remembered as a strong and dependable member of the community was a force that bound the group together, encouraging cooperation and mutual support through the hardest of times. The cyclical view of time. We tend to see time as a straight line, an arrow shot from the past into the future, never to return. The Norse worldview was profoundly different. It was cyclical. Their entire cosmology was built on the rhythm of repeating patterns, the cycle of day and night, the waxing and waning of the moon, and most importantly, the great, slow turning of summer into winter, and winter back into summer. This belief extended to the very end of the universe. Their apocalypse, the great battle of Ragnarok, was not a final, absolute end. It was a violent and necessary destruction that would be followed by a cosmic rebirth. After the old gods and the world had fallen, a new, green world would emerge from the sea, and a new generation of gods and humans would inhabit it. This deep-seated belief in cycles provided a powerful psychological anchor. The winter, no matter how bleak, how long, or how dark, was never perceived as a permanent state. It was understood to be a necessary and natural part of a great wheel that always turned back towards the light. The return of the sun in the spring was not just a hope. It was a cosmic certainty, the embrace of stoic melancholy. Finally, the Viking mind was not built on a foundation of forced optimism. It did not demand happiness as a default state. On the contrary, their poetry and wisdom literature are often filled with a deep, clear-eyed, and profound sense of melancholy. They had a stoic acceptance of the harsh realities of life. They knew that suffering, loss, and death were not aberrations. They were fundamental parts of the human experience. The Havamal, or Sayings of the High One, is filled with advice that is practical, cynical, and deeply realistic. It warns against trusting too easily, advises moderation, and speaks often of the loneliness and sorrow that are part of life. This was not a pessimistic worldview, but a realistic one. They did not expect life to be easy. Therefore, when the genuine hardship of winter arrived, the bitter cold, the gnawing hunger, the darkness, they were not shocked or broken by it. They were mentally prepared. They had already incorporated the reality of suffering into their understanding of the world. This stoic acceptance, this embrace of a certain noble sadness, gave them an immense mental fortitude, allowing them to endure the winter's trials, not with a fragile smile, but with a quiet, clear-eyed, and unbreakable resolve. But the inner fortress of the mind, strong as it was not the only defense against the winter. The Vikings did not believe they were alone in the darkness. They perceived the world as a place teeming with unseen forces, a landscape populated by spirits, ghosts, and gods, whose presence was felt most keenly during the long, quiet nights. To survive the winter was not just a matter of enduring the cold and managing one's own thoughts. It was about navigating a complex and often perilous spiritual reality. This belief system was not a separate part of their lives. It was woven into the very fabric of their existence. The world they saw was just one of 9 realms, and the barriers between these worlds were thought to grow thin in the deep of winter, allowing for strange and sometimes dangerous interactions. Let us explore the key supernatural beliefs that shaped the Viking experience of the darkest time of the year. The thinning of the veil. The Vikings understood the world as a place of layers. Their own world, the world of mortals, was known as Midgard, literally the middle enclosure. But it was surrounded by other realms, the fiery realm of Muspelheim, the icy realm of Niflheim, the land of giants called Jotunheim, and the realms of the gods and the dead. In the vibrant, sunlit days of summer, the boundaries between these worlds were strong and well-defined. But in the deep, dark heart of winter, these boundaries were believed to become porous and thin. The long nights were not just an absence of light. They were a time when the supernatural pressed in close to the world of humanity. The wind howling outside the Longhouse was not just wind. It could be the sound of otherworldly beings passing by. A strange shadow seen at the edge of the firelight was not just a trick of the eye. This belief created a heightened sense of both wonder and caution. It meant that the world was more magical, but also more dangerous. It required a constant awareness, a respect for the unseen, and a careful adherence to the rituals that maintained the fragile border between the world of the living and the worlds that lay beyond. The Landvatir, the spirits of the land. The Vikings held a deep, animistic belief that the land itself was alive, inhabited by a host of spirits known as the Landvatir, or land wights. These were not great gods, but the ancient, localized spirits of a particular place, the spirit of a prominent boulder, a waterfall, a grove of ancient trees, or the family farmstead itself. They were the guardians of the land's prosperity and were considered to be its true, original inhabitants. Maintaining a good relationship with these spirits was essential for survival. In summer, this meant respecting their domains and making offerings. But in winter, when the land appeared to be dead, this relationship became even more crucial. It was the Landvatir who held the life force of the earth in their keeping, and it was they who needed to be placated and honored to ensure that this life force would return in the spring. A farmer might leave a small bowl of porridge or a splash of ale on a special stone, known to be a dwelling place for the wights. This was an act of reciprocity, a gift given to the unseen guardians of the land, in the hope that they would, in turn, gift the family with good fortune and a fertile spring. To anger the Landvatir during winter was to risk the very return of life to the fields. The Draugr, the again walker. Of all the supernatural threats of the winter, perhaps the most terrifying was the Draugr. This was the Viking conception of the undead, but it was far more horrifying than a mindless zombie. The Draugr was the animated corpse of the dead, often a powerful or greedy individual who refused to lie still in their burial mound. They were possessed of superhuman strength, the ability to change their shape, and an undying, malevolent jealousy for the life they had lost. The long winter nights were the prime time for the Draugr to be active. The sagas are filled with chilling tales of these creatures bursting from their tombs to terrorize the surrounding farmsteads. They would attack livestock, wrestle travelers to death, and sometimes even try to break into the Longhouse itself. They were a physical embodiment of the fear of death and the lingering power of the unquiet dead. The belief in the Draugr meant that burial mounds, prominent features of the Scandinavian landscape, were not just memorials. They were places of potential danger, to be avoided especially on the longest, darkest nights of the year, the wild hunt. Finally, the winter sky itself was not empty. Many Germanic and Norse cultures shared a belief in the terrifying phenomenon of the wild hunt. This was a ghostly procession of spectral hunters and hounds that would rage across the night sky, particularly during the turbulent storms of midwinter. The leader of this phantom hunt was often identified as the All-Father God himself, Odin, in his role as the god of the dead, and the receiver of slain warriors. To witness the wild hunt was a terrible omen, often foretelling war, plague, or one's own death. To be caught in its path was to risk being swept up into its fearsome procession forever. The sound of the hunt, the baying of hounds, the shouting of hunters, the thundering of spectral hoofs was said to be carried on the winter wind. This belief transformed the natural sounds of a winter storm into a deeply supernatural and terrifying event. It reinforced the idea that the Longhouse was a tiny, fragile island of safety in a cosmos filled with chaotic, powerful, and utterly indifferent divine forces. The hunt was a reminder that even the gods had a wild, untamable, and dangerous side, a side that was most visible in the deep heart of winter,